I can't hear you, Verena. I think you muted.
You can hear me now, right?
Perfect.
Fantastic. You can hear me, you can see me. It's all online. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Steffi, and organizers of Mapping Ancient Africa seminars to invite me and present our, well, hottest and very freshly published results from Chaubahar. I have been delighted, well, about the invitation, but as well that this perfectly fits our just last week published paper in Nature Geoscience. I've seen that a couple of my co-authors are here online as well, so that's even more exciting. So I can, you know, direct some of the questions probably to them even later. Fantastic. Yes, so today, my name is Verena Foerster. I'm from University of Cologne, and we will talk today about how and if Pleistocene climate variability in Eastern Africa has influenced human or hominin evolution in Eastern Africa. Okay, so I'm presenting this on behalf of my 22 co-authors, you will see at the top. And as I already said, well, this is just freshly in the press. And as I learned, well, very happily last month, we will actually make it to the front cover of the October issue, which is apparently not fully out. So this is the background of that. Very briefly, I guess most of you are very well aware with this, but the question is, of course, behind what, I mean, it's always fun to go and call somewhere in Africa, but of course, there is a bigger research question behind that. And that was, what role did climate dynamics play in human evolution, the dispersal of Homo sapiens, and key cultural innovations? And in order to, well, at least address some of those big questions and to understand what the environmental context of this might have been, we are part of the Hominin Sites and Paleolinks drilling project. Most of you are very sure I'm aware of. And some of the hypotheses, you know, in the background, highlighting whether it's that it's not entirely sure whether it was rather a stable habitat or the transition going from wet to dry or the other direction, or actually the climate variability that has pushed or facilitated or been, well, responsible for big steps and milestones in human evolution. So as most of you know as well, probably, a couple of key fossil findings in the last, let's say, 5 years more or less, have forced the entire community to profoundly rethink and revise the time frame, but as well the region, you know, concentrating on this sort of question. So while Eastern Africa has been in the focus for a very long time now, with, you know, some of the key fossil finds in Hato and Homo, of course, findings in the Jebel Hood, you know, pushed this sort of rethinking and a step towards a more multi-regional approach into the first redirection. Of course, then additional findings in the Epidema Cave and Mislia and many, many more are kind of supporting that new framework that is behind that all. So, however, where comes the core from Chaubahar into the game? Well, the goal is, of course, reconstruction of paleo environments and the paleoclimate in the time frame or the different key steps in hominin evolution, in order to understand better how possible corridors would have enabled or facilitated migration, not just within the African continent, but possibly also beyond, and to understand what the living conditions were for hominin populations living, especially in Eastern Africa. This is something we are partially able to answer right now. So Chaubahar in southern Ethiopia is a fantastic archive of environmental history for human evolution and dispersal. And as you can see here, we have done a lot of work the last, well, 10 years, even more. But we are highlighting today the duplicate cores that are around 280 meters long and that were merged into a fantastic, nearly continuous composite core. And we're focusing on that. Chaubahar is, well, a pretty deep tectonic basin, which is 3 kilometers, 5 kilometers, we don't really know. However, it's deep and it's filled with sedimentary infill, which serve as a fantastic climate archive. It's just a matter how deep you basically drill. What's also making this quite attractive is, and we will hear more about that next week from Celine Vidal, it's only 90 kilometers east of the Omotucana Basin, where the just very recently redated Homo sapiens fossils were found. Also, the Chapot-Bahr transect intersects with the southwestern Ethiopian highlands, which have been hypothesized to have possibly, potentially been a refuge area during times when it was extremely hot and extremely dry in the lowlands, but still relatively wet and covered with some vegetation in the highlands. Yes, and this is where we caught in, it has already been a couple of years now, 2014. So a long journey for this core and for this climate record. This is Chapot-Bahr. As you can see, there is no longer a lake. So we know that this basin was filled with a paleo lake during wet episodes, but today it's a very extensive saline mudflat. There's beautiful work of my colleague and co-author Julian Ruddock, who has, taken an artistic perspective on this. You are more than invited to look more into this if you're interested. Well, good news is we know that with the 280 meter core, we are covering the last 620,000 years, thanks to the fantastic age model by Helen Roberts and colleagues. And I will say a bit more about resolution in a bit. Although I would be ecstatic almost, to talk more about potassium, elitization, and orthogenic minerals, I think we don't have the time today. So you are invited to ask me questions about this. However, to cut a very long story rather short, we established potassium as our key proxy in Chapot-Bahr. It has almost taken us 10 years. As you might tell from a couple of key publications you can see here. And what we learned is, however, that the degree of orthogenic alteration that we see in Chapot-Bahr is a very useful proxy, because the Chapot-Bahr minerals have recorded and sensitively recorded even the subtle changes in the hydrochemistry and of the Paleolake and pore waters. So as you can see by the nice little saline puddles in the background, this is something that has been continuously and very reliably working in Chapot-Bahr. So coming to the hot part of the story, this is the result of all the very sweaty and long-term research. I'm very happy to present here, in my first proper talk on this now published paper, the full climate history on an evolutionary timescale coming from Chapot-Bahr. And you can see here on the x-axis to the very right, we have 620,000 years moving towards modern conditions here towards the left. What we see here as the main indicator is the variations of the potassium. I just briefly mentioned that, the potassium-zirconium ratio that we were able to establish as a reliable proxy for the hydroclimatic changes during the last 620,000 years in Eastern Africa. And that is very beautiful, and I'm very proud of that our time series from Chapot-Bahr has an average resolution of 10 years. So a decadal resolution in that time series enables to address some of the major questions we very briefly cut into in the beginning of my talk. What you can see here are fluctuations, well, you already guessed that, between humid and arid. So note the inverted scale on the y-axis. So where we have high values, we have arid conditions. Where we have low values, again, inverted scale, we have humid conditions. If you look at the whole time series, you can see that we have variations, shifts, cyclic oscillations, well, a lot of different terms for climatic change. How do we measure what would have, well, caused environmental stress, possibly? or definitely habitat transformations for hominin populations in the area. How do you put that in boxes, and how do you compare that on an evolutionary timescale? Well, of course, keeping in mind that both the climatic record, but as well the archaeological record have their constraints, but still having a look on an evolutionary timescale enables us to, address some of the major questions we looked at in the beginning. And how can we structure the long record? I will come to that in the next slide. For now, I would just very briefly like to draw your attention to, well, the magnitude of change we do actually see here. So Markus Fischer applied a very nice hydro model to the work we have done in Chapot-Bahr, and with that we were able to get a order of magnitude perspective on the entire things. So while you see values on this level here would refer to modern conditions in Chapot-Bahr, values on this level would relate to the African humid period, which most of you know was characterized by extensive and deep freshwater lakes, like the one you can see here in the back. A beautiful picture of my colleague Annette Junginger. This is Lake Suguta, and we know that during the African humid period, Lake Suguta, for instance, was 300 meters deep, so a very deep, large freshwater lake in the Eastern African Rift. And moving out of the African humid period to modern, more or less modern dry conditions meant that these huge lakes disappeared within a short period of time, which would have meant, just for the little example we're doing here with the African humid period, a transformation from, huge lakes in the area with lush and green vegetation, and of course plentiful resources for populations in the area, whereas the modern day conditions, these are pictures from Chapot-Bahr in the lower right corner, where we have very dry conditions. The lake there has completely vanished during most of the year, dust storms, and the water reduced to saline puddles. So you just remember that I have said, how do we structure such a long record? Of course, you can go with a very intuitive approach, which is what we did in the beginning. However, we learned you need some sort of statistics, and there are many, I can tell you, there are many different ways to, put this all in different phases or episodes, or, to get some tools if you want to compare phases or episodes with similar environmental conditions to see, what sort of change would have possibly affected hominins in the area. So what we did here was apply a change point analysis after Martin Trauth's approach presented in 2018 on the short course, and we applied that now to the long time series of Chapot-Bahr. And while we started just looking at the trends, the long-term trends in the beginning, we had to revise that after a bit. And we thought, it's not just the trend going from wet to dry, or from or the other direction. It might as well be, of course, the mean, moving from very wet to generally more dry conditions, and of course the fluctuations in between. So the standard deviation as a third measurement of climatic change. So applying that change point analysis to the full record and using these three indicators, or these three measurements of climatic change, resulted in 15 major change points, of course with some overlaps. We this yielded in 13 shorter and longer intervals, and each of those intervals was then characterized by similar environmental conditions. A little bit of statistics here. So the result of that is what you can see here in that colorful bar. So these are the 13 resulting environmental episodes, and you will instantly see that some of them are shorter and some of them are longer. So the red ones are the changes in the trend, the yellow ones are the changes in the standard deviation, and the blue ones in the arithmetic mean. So we portioned them, and we will go through that step by step, because I mean, these are the main results of the entire exercise we did there. So what you see in episodes 1 to 6 is, well, in episodes 1, 2, and majorly 6, rather stable humid conditions. Those are interrupted by some extreme oscillations between wet and dry in episode 3, but definitely 4 and 5. That, and we will look at that in a second step, how that would have affected the habitat of populations in the area. So remember, rather stable and wet, interrupted by some extremes. Then we're moving into the next big block with episodes 7 to 9, and you can see that we have some intensifying low frequency oscillations that we see there. So while it's still rather humid in episode 7, we can see that, you know, the speed is picking up, and we see those low frequency oscillations. Whereas we have an onset of a long-term aridification trend with the onset of episode 8. It's very subtle, but it's there. And this is definitely picking up towards more drier conditions from episode 9 on. And if you compare that to the orbital controls of this in the lower part of the figure here, you can nicely see how the eccentricity modulated precession is like really having a strong effect on the oscillations that are expressed in the Chapot-Bahr time series here. Moving now to the last block, so episodes 10 to 13, you can see that, well, flickering is really, climate flickering is really picking up. So this is the phase, or this is the part of the record that shows an unprecedented increase in variability, well, both in frequency, but as well in magnitude as well. And on top of that, we have, on top of those high frequency alternations, we see the most arid conditions of the entire record. So we're getting into those climate flickers and extreme arid conditions towards the most modern part of the record. So connecting that now with milestones in human evolution, well, and the question we put there in the beginning, which was, is climate change linked with increasing versatility and innovation in the hominin lineage? Yes, well, we're looking now at the record and comparing that on evolutionary scales. We have done the following. I mean, there are many different, which archaeological findings to include and which ones to exclude. Very difficult, and I must say that I'm probably not, well, I learned those things from my colleagues. I have been working with the climate record here, but I've learned a lot in the last couple of years, and I'm very looking forward to the discussion afterwards. However, what we have done here was compare those episodes of, you know, significant environmental conditions in Eastern Africa that we learn from the Chapot-Bahr record, and compare that to the key phases of modern human origins, like a concept recently published by Bergström and colleagues in 2021. And Bergström and colleagues basically differentiated 3 major phases in modern human origin, which is phase 1, the separation of modern human ancestors from the archaic human groups, then phase 2, the African origins of human diversity, and in the last and very short 3rd phase, the global dispersal of Homo sapiens. And now we are comparing that step by step to what we just learned about the environmental episodes in the Chapot-Bahr record. So what you see here on the axis is we have, again, the environmental episodes we just walked through, but then as well, we see major archaeological finds in Eastern Africa, key fossil finds in Eastern Africa and the Levante, and well, concept of cultural innovations, behavioral transitions, and again, the key phases that we just talked about. So what happened in episodes 1 to 6? Well, while we have those rather stable wet humid conditions interrupted by those climatic, well, extreme oscillations, we would definitely had a fragmentation of habitats. yeah, which would have caused vicariance, the shift in population ranges, and most likely local extinctions of hominin populations. So that would have meant that the Middle Pleistocene morphological diversity we do see in this major phase might be the result of adaptations to a then novel and dramatically transformed environment. Think back to the little exercise we did with the order of magnitude change. You know, the large landscapes with vegetation and lakes is disappearing, and everything would have been very, very different within a reasonable short amount of time, and that several times. Yes, so the idea is that small and reproductively and culturally isolated populations would have been around in that time, and this could have been a key, or the dramatic oscillations and then again stable conditions might have been a key stimuli to the appearance of the morphological diversity. We're moving into the second big block. Again, remember, this is the time where we see the appearance of Homo sapiens in Eastern Africa. It has been there already in Northwestern Africa. However, talking about, or with a little focus on Eastern Africa, this is, and we will hear more about that next week, is the time frame where the fossil findings of the Homo kibish and how to fit in, and the representing generally the genetic heterogeneity there. But this is also the time where we see the Acheulean Middle Stone Age transition. That, of course, might have differences between what we see in Ethiopia compared to what we see in Kenya. However, this is where we have the gradual transition in Ethiopia from the Acheulean associate technology to Middle Stone Age findings in that area. And the climate in that time, remember, is the increasing cyclic variability that we see both in frequency and in magnitude. So as a response to those rather, increasframe rapid transformations that we could deduct from the climatic change in that part, is that the time frame might not have been long enough to exclusively adapt physically, but most adaptations in that time frame might have been primarily cultural. So this is why, or this is what my colleagues explained to me, might be why this is the time frame where we have the key phase of technological and social innovations that could have worked as a sort of buffer to some of the most dramatic changes in the area. And then the very, compared to the other phases, rather short part is where we see the global dispersal. And, that is the tricky part, because if you look at the record, it's getting pretty dramatically dry, and it's getting extremely, variable. So you see those high frequency oscillations, those climate flickers picking up from the beginning of phase 10. However, there is a very brief return to wet conditions. And we see, if we compare that to climate records in the Levante Eastern Mediterranean, we nicely see that these more or less align with some of the wet phases we see there. So we don't know for sure. However, this might have presented an opportunity, that alignment of the wet phases might have presented an opportunity to migrate and to disperse through some sort of corridors. Okay. However, this is not just the time of dispersal, but if you look at the part about the composite or about the cultural innovation, this is definitely when, the innovations are picking up and the cultural component is becoming more and more important. And this might have been the flickers we see there, plus the long-term aridification trend might have worked as a sort of motor for indigenous cultural change. And this is as well the time where we see the transition from the Middle Stone Age to the later Stone Age. Okay, seeing all that together here in one overview enables me to, put the big first question up again, whether climate change or how far climate change is linked with versatility and innovation in the hominin lineage. And after that, well, comparing both the climatic change and the different measures of climate variability and comparing that to the archaeological record shows that yes, the profound transformation of the hominin habitats that we can deduct from the climatic record must have played a major role in both human biological and cultural evolution, and has shaped the adaptation and providing potential opportunities to facilitate the dispersal around the globe from that area. And with that, I would really like to thank you for the opportunity to present our results here. Very much looking forward to the discussion and some of the questions, and would like to thank you for your interest, and of course, the funding agency for making this possible in the first place. Thank you.